Almost done with Aquinas. I just want to talk for a few minutes about some implications of Aquinas, and then we'll do our chart. So, some implications that I think are pretty solid. First, as we've seen before, God and humans are not competitive. For Aquinas and his classical theist tradition, which is basically everyone we've talked about, God is not a being among beings. God isn't just a bigger version of us. God is being itself. Um, I'm going to pick on the new atheists, which again, there are lots of valid reasons to be an atheist. The reason I pick on the new atheists is because they say dumb things um, about religion, which they've just decided not to understand. They'll say things like, I don't believe in the fairies at the bottom of a garden. I don't believe in God. Well, for someone in Aquinas' tradition, it's just a category error. Fairies are a kind of created being. Um, might be magical, but they're beings. God is being as such, right? And so it's a whole different plane of existence. Or the kind of notion that you can't prove empirically God, right? Science can't prove God. Well, Aquinas would say, well, of course not. Science deals in the created realm. God is being itself. And to think that science could prove God one way or the other is, again, just a category error. For Aquinas and this tradition, we can't act without God because God is the primary cause of everything. So in that sense, there's a way in which everything is already graced. Existence itself is grace because we don't have to exist. God doesn't need us to exist. Existence itself is a gift of God. And then for Aquinas and this tradition, true freedom is being able to act in concert with God. True freedom is being aligned with God and being habituated towards the good, having your habits formed so they are the good. This is a very different definition of freedom than I think the one we often think about in the United States, where freedom tends to be the ability to choose among options. So I am free in a lot of modern culture to the extent that I have choices. So I can go to the store and I can pick among 30 different kinds of cereal. That makes me free. For people like Aquinas, that isn't freedom, not at least in the theological sense. Freedom is the ability to be as you were created to be, which is aligned with God. So there is, for somebody like Aquinas, a really real sense in which the truly freest people aren't really making decisions a whole lot. They are simply doing what they are to do out of love. That they actually don't have the freedom to do the wrong thing. Thomas Aquinas said, if I can do the wrong thing, I'm not really free, right? True freedom is simply doing the good naturally, or what feels like you're so habituated that it becomes natural. Now I'm going to talk about some possible implications. Some places people have said that Aquinas' thought can go, um, but Aquinas doesn't go there. These are possible implications. So the first one is, I think, pretty solid. If God is the unmoved mover, the unactual actualizer, God does not change towards us, which means that God can only ever be love toward us. This is something that a mystic who lived about 200 years after Aquinas, 150 I guess, named Julian of Norwich stressed very strongly. Julian talked about how God is just love towards us. She talked about God being that which sustains us in love from moment to moment. She was famous because she had a vision when in her 30s. She got very, very sick and she couldn't move and she thought she was going to die. And she looked at the cross on her wall and she had this vision of kind of the world as it appears through the cross. And this is what she says about her vision. Do you want to know what your Lord meant? You know well that love was what he meant. Who showed you this? Love. What did he show you? Love. Why did he show it to you? For love. This is how I was taught that our Lord's meaning was love. So that for Julian, in everything, God is only ever love. Again, this sort of sense that we're feeling the wrath of God or anything like that is only from our side. Aquinas may not have had a problem with any of that. Here's where some people push both Aquinas and Julian. Julian argues again that God sustains everything that is in love, which could suggest that everything that is saved. Aquinas does not go there. Aquinas clearly believes in hell. Julian doesn't ever say that everyone is saved or everyone is redeemed, but the way that she deploys kind of a Thomistic, there's that word, Thomas Aquinas, Thomistic view of God as the pure act of love, can move in this direction, right? God sustains everything that is. And then you say, well, what about evil? Well, going back to Augustine, evil isn't a thing, it's an absence of a thing. So ultimately, God can have evil just not have any space. But everything that is, everything that in any way responds to God, is saved, possibly, because God loves it and that sustains it and that ultimately saves and redeems it. Again, Aquinas doesn't go there. Julian never says it explicitly, but it's one way of thinking about what this idea that God is a pure act of love sustaining everything could mean. Just an interesting idea. All right, here's our chart for Aquinas: God, Jesus Christ, human problem, and right relationship. You can pause it and fill this out on your own, or you can just go to the next slide. So again, for Aquinas, God talks about God as the unmoved mover. God is necessary. God has to exist for Aquinas. There's just no way for anything, to exist if there's not this unactualized actualizer. And God is who moves us to the good. Right? God is the one who moves us back into relationship with God. I'm leaving Jesus Christ blank. Not that Thomas Aquinas doesn't say anything about Jesus, but he's very much aligned with Chalcedon. Rowan Williams actually has written extensively on Aquinas's Christology, and so just sort of assume that anything Rowan Williams said about Jesus, Aquinas would pretty much be on board for. All right, human problem. We lack, after the fall, we lack original justice. We are guilty because we lack original justice. We are habituated or inclined incorrectly. Now, the last thing I want to be clear is that for Aquinas, we always need God. Now, that for Aquinas isn't a human problem. That's just created order, right? You always are going to need God if you are created. That's not a human problem, but it's a human reality. Our problem is the first part of that, that we lack original justice, that we're guilty, that we're habituated incorrectly. Right relationship, remember, we're habituated away from God. God moves humans back to God or to justice, infuses them with grace, with love, with hope, and as we become holier, we are justified. What we didn't talk about, but which is true for Aquinas, is that God does this to some people and not others. He's working again in an Augustinian framework. So because God has to move people to justice, for Aquinas, God does that to some and just not others. He talks in some ways about God just passing by some people. So it's kind of a softened predestination. You don't have a God who's sitting up there saying, well, you're saved and you're damned, but it's still predestination in the sense that God is choosing, and if you're not chosen, there's really nothing you can do about it. All right, so that's our chart. Finally, I want to say that after Thomas, things fall apart. And this is bringing us now to Luther. So, two major things. After Thomas, the papacy goes through about 100 or so years of just chaos. For a variety of political reasons, the Pope relocates from Rome to Avignon, France, where the Pope is then very much under the political control of the French king. That makes the Pope look much more like the puppet of one political ruler than kind of the spiritual father of the church. The Avignon papacies are very luxurious. There's a lot of simony, selling of offices. There's just a lot of corruption in the church during this time. And then to make matters worse, when the papacy returns to Rome, they get a reforming pope. That makes a bunch of people mad, and so they elect another pope, who then goes to Avignon. And for 39 years, there are 2, sometimes 3 people all competing to be the pope. And this is a pretty big deal. If you remember, the pope is supposed to be able to bind and loose. You don't know who's binding and loosing or who's really in charge. It's just not a good time in terms of the church or the confidence of people in the church. And then, and this may sound familiar, there was the Black Death, plague, that went through places in Europe throughout the 14th century, but particularly between 1347 and 1351, decimating populations. Between a third and a half of certain populations just died, and it was quick. You could be well in the morning and dead by the evening, and just entire villages could be wiped out. It was a time where then uneducated priests would sometimes have to sort of take control. So now your international leaders are bad, and now you might have a priest who really doesn't know anything, but has become a priest because all of the priests have been killed. So there's just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of lack of knowledge. What's interesting here is that it's after this, shortly after this, at the end of the 14th century, that Julian has her vision. I think it's telling that this woman, in the midst of all of this uncertainty, had this vision of the deep love of God. And rather than looking at the world and saying either God's abandoned us, or, well, there's a really clear reason for all of this. She doesn't say either of those two things. She looks through the cross and just says, God is love. God is holding us, and that she has a famous line that says, all will be well. By which she doesn't mean kind of optimistically, well, I'm sure it's going to get better, but just that God will redeem and that we can trust God. It's one of the more amazing things that, given all that she lived through, that was Julian's idea at the end. That takes us up pretty close to Luther. When we get to Luther next week, what I'm going to suggest you do is watch at least the first video first and get some background, then read Luther, and then go from there. But we will talk about that next time. All right.